forget the fairy tales. Tonight we re-pulling back the curtain on a topic that's equal parts sacred and scandalous. The real story of intimacy in the Middle Ages. This was a world of gallant knights and questionable potions, where romance often hinged on a whispered prayer, and a prayer that no one was looking. So, as you settle in, if you appreciate the deep dives we do, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd love to see where you rushing from in the comments. It's always a highlight to see our global audience. Now, lower the lights, maybe find a quiet corner, and let's step back in time together. Let's shatter the first illusion. Intimacy in the Middle Ages rarely happened on silk sheets in a candlelit room with a lute playing softly. The reality was a cramped, single-room home shared with the entire family, children, elderly relatives, a few goats, and a chicken with a territorial streak. Privacy, as we know it, was a foreign concept. For most peasants, the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were essentially the same space, distinguished only by their competing aromas. If a couple sought a moment alone, they needed to be inventive. Timing was everything. So was noise level. And ideally, the children needed to be asleep and facing the other way. Curtains were a status symbol. Beds were communal. Even in wealthy households, servants might be sleeping at the foot of the bed or standing guard in a corner, dutifully pretending to be invisible. Many noble families kept detailed records of bedroom activities for legal and religious purposes, which is precisely as awkward as it sounds. Travel offered no escape. Inns featured shared beds, meaning total strangers might end up side by side for the night, making a private moment even more of a challenge. Fancy a bit of affection? Better hope your bedmate isn't a stranger who still has their boots on. If you were married, and both of you were awake and relatively clean, you could find a straw mattress and hope for the best. If you weren't married, you had to be twice as discreet and 3 times as cautious. In small communities with thin walls, gossip spread faster than the plague. For those in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No privacy, no temptations, and definitely no hushed conversations after dark. But even in these devout settings, human nature had a way of complicating things, which might explain why so many abbeys were built with exceptionally high garden walls. In medieval Europe, few institutions shaped daily life more than the church, and it had a formidable amount to say about what happened behind closed doors or, more accurately, behind shared drapes. According to religious doctrine, physical intimacy served one main purpose: procreation. That's all. It wasn't about pleasure, connection, or unwinding. It was about making more people. Anything else was a distraction at best and a sin at worst. This wasn't just a topic for Sunday sermons. Bishops, theologians, and confessors produced detailed manuals outlining acceptable and unacceptable acts. Just in case anyone got creative, certain days were forbidden. So were major feast days, fast days, holy days, and in some places entire liturgical seasons. Hoping for a romantic evening during Lent? Forget it. Advent? Also no, that left you with a handful of Tuesdays in April, maybe. Even within the bounds of marriage, there were rules. Couples were advised to approach each other with modesty and restraint. Affection was tolerated, but not passion. Passionate displays were, to be blunt, condemned. One 13th century text instructed married couples to engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, a checklist devoid of any joy. The missionary position was preferred not merely for its symbolism, but because it was deemed the most natural and least likely to offend God or the local priest. Anything more adventurous was viewed with suspicion. Even enthusiasm was questionable. Confession played a major role. Priests often posed direct and probing questions to determine if a couple had violated any of these guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual queries. They were startlingly specific. Let's just say the typical 14th century friar knew more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement varied. Some regions were lax, some priests looked the other way, and many ordinary people, especially peasants, just smiled, nodded, and quietly did as they pleased. If you think modern couples struggle to align their schedules, spare a thought for medieval people. Arranging a romantic night in the Middle Ages involved a calendar, a cleric's approval, and the luck of St. Valentine himself who, Ironically, was never married. The church had strong opinions, which were really strict rules about when intimacy was permissible. Sundays were out. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays were a no-go, a day of penance. Wednesdays were also suspect. Factor in Lent, Advent, numerous saints' feast days. Holy days, fast days, and sometimes even phases of the moon, and the calendar transformed from a schedule into a divine minefield. The goal was to keep the soul fixed on heavenly matters, even when the body had earthly ideas. There were actual lists of forbidden days. Some confessional manuals designated nearly half the year as off-limits. If you felt particularly amorous on one of these prohibited days, you could expect a heavy dose of spiritual guilt and an extra session in the confessional. One 13th century bishop berated a married couple for their excessive affection, which apparently meant more than once a month. He suggested they redirect that energy toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not amused. Naturally, the upper classes were more constrained by these rules, with chaplains and confessors constantly monitoring them. Peasants, on the other hand, adopted a more practical approach. Their lives were dictated by livestock, weather, and survival, leaving little room to worry about whether Tuesday was the feast of Saint Who Cares. To complicate matters further, some believed that intimacy at the wrong time could lead to sickly children, divine retribution, or worst of all, a bad reputation. If your neighbors learned you were celebrating a bit too fervently during Lent, it could result in public shame, endless gossip, or a pointed sermon delivered with unwavering eye contact. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling head over heels in love, and more about falling into a binding contract. If you dreamed of candlelit dinners and whispered sweet nothings, you were better off reading a troubadour's ballad. For most people, courtship involved livestock, property lines, and two families agreeing not to feud. Marriage was, first and foremost, a business transaction. Daughters were bartered to forge alliances, acquire land, or settle disputes over whose pig ransacked whose garden. A bride might bring a dowry of coins, linens, or a small plot of farmland. The groom's family, in return, might pledge to be only moderately difficult. Courtship, if it occurred, was heavily supervised. Young people were rarely left alone. A young woman might be chaperoned by her mother, a grim-faced aunt, or, if the stakes were high, an entire village deeply invested in whether you so much as held hands. Among the nobility, arranged marriages were standard practice. Kings and lords treated marriages like strategic chess moves. Affection was something you might develop later, or not at all. As a medieval saying went, better a wealthy match with a sour face than a poor one with dimples. So romantic. Even for peasants, practicality reigned. A man's worth was measured by his land, his tools, or the sturdiness of his ox. A woman was judged on her domestic skills, her reputation, and her ability to avoid causing drama at the market. This isn't to say love was non-existent. It certainly was. But it typically followed marriage rather than preceding it. If affection blossomed over time, it was a welcome bonus, not a prerequisite. Think of it as medieval emotional DLC, not part of the main game. Yet, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret glances, flirtatious songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unofficial side quests of medieval dating. But you had to be careful. Get caught stealing a kiss behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very unhappy father holding a pitchfork. Let's dismantle one of the most enduring myths about medieval romance, the chastity belt. You've seen them in movies, cartoons, or unfortunate museum displays. Iron contraptions supposedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband was away at war, keeping her physically and morally secure, except it's not really true. There is no credible historical evidence that chastity belts were a widespread practice during the Middle Ages. In fact, most surviving examples date from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods that were more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than the reality. Many of these belts were created as gag gifts, cautionary objects, or museum oddities, not as functional garments. Medieval records, which meticulously document all sorts of uncomfortable details, are strangely silent on the mass production of chastity belts. No tailor advertised them, no laws governed their use, and no church distributed them at weddings. It's almost as if, and bear with me here, they weren't a real thing. This makes sense because the design is a logistical nightmare. Medieval hygiene was already a challenge. Imagine adding a rusty metal device with no instruction manual and a padlock requiring a blacksmith. It would have caused far more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth originate? Likely from a mix of later moral anxieties and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors embraced the image of the repressed medieval woman. It supported their narrative, and nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in one's undergarments. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and effective means. Shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic alliances. Noble women were chaperoned relentlessly. Peasant girls were watched by their entire village like unpaid detectives. Any hint of scandal could lead to a ruined reputation, a lost dowry, or an awkward confession about what happened at the edge of the barley field. In a surprising twist that might shock their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right, in numerous parts of medieval Europe, especially in cities, brothels were legal, tax-paying businesses. Town councils issued licenses, collected revenue, and even established designated red light districts long before the invention of the light bulb. Some cities even appointed officials to oversee them, known as brothel keepers or, more picturesquely, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful job title. The logic behind this was pragmatic, if a bit cynical. Authorities believed that providing a controlled outlet for male desire would reduce the likelihood of greater sins, such as adultery, assault, or heaven forbid unsupervised dancing. Regulated brothels were viewed as a necessary evil to maintain social order, much like traffic laws or the existence of turnips. The church, naturally, was not enthusiastic. Officially, it condemned the practice, but unofficially, many clergy members looked the other way. Some even profited by collecting rent from these very establishments. If that sounds hypocritical, congratulations, you've understood the core of medieval religious practice. Life in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't always a life of pure misery either. Some women entered the profession for economic reasons, particularly widows or those without family to support them. Others were forced or trafficked into it, especially in port cities where sailors brought both coin and chaos. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks on how to manage these establishments, outlining rules for clean sheets, basic health checks, and set hours. Patrons hailed from all social strata, knights, apprentices, merchants, and even monks, despite vows that strongly advised against it. Fees varied, services were itemized, and in some instances, customers paid with eggs, wool, or whatever else they could barter. Medieval tinder it was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickers, a breeze whispers through the thatch, and your beloved leans in close only to reveal a powerful medieval musk. When it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had its priorities straight. Staying clean was on the list, but it ranked somewhere below surviving the plague, mending the roof, and retrieving the pig from the pantry. Bathing did occur, just not as frequently as modern sensibilities might prefer. Peasants bathed rarely, perhaps once a month, or more often if they accidentally fell into a river. Soap was a homemade or imported luxury used sparingly. Public bathhouses existed in towns, but they were often closed during epidemics or moral panics, or both. If you were wealthy, you had more options. A hot bath could be prepared, scented with herbs, and followed by a rub-down with linen towels. If you were poor, a bath meant a cold bucket of water and the hope that your personal aroma would overpower the smell of the stables. To complicate things, water itself was sometimes regarded with suspicion, particularly cold water. Some believed frequent bathing could weaken the body or expose the skin to disease. Others simply lacked the time, the tub, or access to water that wasn't already contested by the local geese. Now imagine trying to woo someone under these circumstances. Perfume was for the elite. Deodorant was a futuristic fantasy. Dental care, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew on mint leaves if you were feeling sophisticated. Kissing was, without a doubt, an adventure. Clothing didn't improve the situation. Layers of wool, leather, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every odor you encountered throughout the day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still managed to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps standards were just different. Or perhaps when everyone smelled equally of life, love was truly blind and noseblind. In medieval Europe, family planning was like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a deeply uncooperative goat. It was technically possible, but you couldn't rely on it. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception was ineffective by today's standards doesn't mean medieval couples were clueless. They knew that certain actions led to babies, and they went to great, if occasionally bizarre, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods involved herbal concoctions, animal membranes, and rituals that required burying specific items near a doorway. One popular remedy suggested drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who, hopefully, knew what they were doing. A few guides even suggested that jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would work, which at the very least probably burned a few calories. There were also early forms of barrier methods, though calling them effective would be an overstatement. Linen soaked in various solutions was one option. A few daring individuals tried wax. There are also scattered mentions of what we might call medieval prototypes of later devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The Church, of course, was not a fan. Any attempt to prevent conception was often condemned as sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the declared purpose of marriage, and anything that interfered with that divine directive was frowned upon, often loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone listened. Among married couples, especially those facing poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was a powerful motivator. And for unmarried couples, the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was abysmally low. Birth control, such as it was, relied on folk remedies, local herbs, and a tremendous amount of hope. And when it inevitably failed, well, that's when hasty marriages, concealed pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations began. Despite what church leaders preached, not every medieval couple waited for the wedding bells to chime before getting close. In fact, the practice of trying out the goods before marriage was common enough to generate a lot of paperwork, known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of oneself in village gossip. Premarital intimacy wasn't rare, but it was certainly policed. In towns and parishes across Europe, officials maintained moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of public shame. If a couple was caught or even suspected of jumping the gun, they could be summoned before a local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and sometimes to the person who claimed to have witnessed the act. Medieval snitching was a thriving business. Fines were adjusted based on whether it was a first offense, if a pregnancy occurred, or if the couple eventually married. In some cases, tying the knot afterward waived the fine a sort of retroactive permission slip. In others, the fine was still levied, but at a reduced rate. Think of it as an early bird penalty. And let's not forget the social fallout. In small, interconnected communities, everyone knew everything. So, even if the local priest was merciful, your neighbors wouldn't be. Gossip could ruin reputations faster than a spoiled pie in July. In medieval Europe, the concept of consent existed, but not as we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual desire or enthusiastic agreement. Instead, it was enmeshed in legal codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional societal shrug. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize consent in marriage. In fact, marriage was deemed valid if both parties verbally agreed, even without a priest present. That's right, two people saying "I do" in a field could technically be married, romantic, possibly, legally messy, absolutely. But here's the catch. Just because consent was recognized in theory didn't mean it was honored in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after the deal was sealed. Families brokered marriages like they were peace treaties. The young woman's opinion might be politely solicited or strongly suggested, but ultimately the dowry spoke louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were wider, but still constrained by pressure. Refusing a match could lead to economic hardship or social ostracism. Saying no to the local landlord's son was even riskier. Within marriage, consent grew even murkier. Husbands had a legal right to their wives' bodies, and refusing them could be grounds for a formal complaint or annulment. Some church theologians argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a financial obligation but was far less voluntary. Still, the situation wasn't entirely bleak. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, particularly when there were witnesses or the accused lacked powerful allies. In cities like London and Paris, court records show both women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes achieving justice or at least causing a public scandal. And let's not forget the literary world. Medieval stories are filled with complex power dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for instance, often revolved around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone swooning dramatically. If nothing else, they understood it was important to ask, even if they sometimes ignored the answer. If you ever got the sense the medieval church had a complex relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complex, it was deeply suspicious. That suspicion extended directly into the bedrooms of married couples, where the church ideally preferred that nothing too enjoyable was taking place. To be fair, the church didn't prohibit marital relations entirely. That would have been a logistical disaster for inheritance, population growth, and humanity itself. But it did advocate for moderation, extreme moderation. The kind of moderation that involved doing it once a month in the dark without smiling. Theologians of the era lauded celibacy as the ultimate form of spiritual devotion. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining completely, especially if they were older, more devout, or simply fed up with each other. A couple who voluntarily renounced intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood or at least halfway to separate bedrooms. Some church figures like Saint Jerome went even further. He contended that even within marriage, desire was a moral failing. Marital relations were permissible only for procreation, not for fun. Not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly attractive in their woolen nightgown. This perspective trickled down into confessionals and moral guidebooks. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Imagine the awkward pause that followed that question at the altar rail. And yet, people carried on with their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles would nod politely to the church's teachings, then go home and do whatever felt right between their chores, taxes, and the occasional peasant revolt. Let's be honest. After a long day of threshing barley or settling a land dispute, a little affection probably felt more comforting than sinful. But for the truly pious, celibate marriages were held up as the gold standard of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and regarded carnal urges as a thing of the past, or at least a thing best left to the younger, less holy villagers. After everything we've discussed, arranged marriages, fines for holding hands, herbal contraceptives, questionable bathing habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people ever actually fall in love? The answer is yes. They fell in love awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social rules and moralizing sermons, love found ways to blossom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and at markets, exchanging favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over the turnip stall. Noble lovers swapped poems and secret glances during formal dinners while pretending to be fascinated by hunting falcons. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with such emotion that modern scholars still debate whether it was spiritual devotion or something more. Literature from the period is saturated with romance. Troubadours sang of unattainable ladies who inspired knights to perform acts of dramatic, often injurious, valor. Tales of courtly love celebrated longing from afar, especially if you were pining for your boss's wife. Sure, the love was often unfulfilled, but that's where the best poetry comes from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records exist of peasants who eloped or defied matches arranged by their families. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the dismay of their family's accountant. The church, interestingly, actually mandated verbal consent from both the bride. and groom, even if that consent was given through clenched teeth while holding a goose as part of the dowry. And once married, many couples forged strong, loving partnerships. They worked together, raised children, survived plagues, and navigated tax season, which is basically the medieval equivalent of a romantic vacation. Letters between spouses, especially when separated, reveal true affection, deep longing, and unwavering commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political advantage, choosing someone they genuinely liked to spend their final years with. Because even after all the rules, the risks, and the rituals, people still long to feel loved, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent.